From the Cold Formed Steel Buildings Association, this is Cold Formed Buildings Made Easy with your hosts, John Cosper and Lauren Toole.
Hello and welcome to Cold Formed Buildings Made Easy. My name is John Cosper and her name is Lauren Toole. We are your hosts and your guides as we explore the exciting opportunities in cold formed steel buildings. Lauren, you've been selling these buildings for quite a while. What's the most unique challenge you've had with designing a building?
Probably the regulations, because every town and city is completely different from East Coast to West Coast. So that is my challenge.
That's definitely a big one. And every town, every municipality has their rules. And as I understand it, there's some places where even though they got the rules set a certain way, you might have a different inspector who might have a different idea as to what's right and what's wrong.
You can have places where you could be on the same street and have different codes or regulations for buildings. I mean, they can be site specific. You know, you get places like California and New York, Florida's getting there, where they vary widely. Typically, our buildings are site specific. If you got a long lat, that's how we have to narrow them down sometimes.
I gotcha. Folks, that's our guest for today. That is Drew Sepp. He is currently with Act Building Systems as a member of our elite support team. If you have the Act Dimensions software, most likely you've seen Drew's name on a ticket, particularly if you've reached out to support at any one given time. Prior to that, Drew sold these buildings. Drew's erected these buildings. He has a lot of experiences and a lot of stories to share with us. Drew, we're glad to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So our first question is, how do you define cold form?
How do you define cold formed buildings? Well, you'd be looking at, the difference is most people just hear steel building and they think of a red iron building. Your traditional building is treated. They're heavier. They require substantially more equipment. Cold form buildings you have the ability to build a steel building with lighter weight materials that are still, exceed standards, engineering. Some of these buildings, we only in the past few years have we gone up to 20-inch frame members. So they've gotten pretty stout, but in reality, with lighter materials, the average person, I've taught probably more people to build their own than contractors. So they can be, if you get something really elaborate and huge, you've got mom and pop probably would struggle on that. But I've helped more than probably half the customers I ever had design and build their own, limited material, limited equipment.
I saw a garage not too long ago, Captain Mike for Ameribuilt, that he designed for his neighbor across the street. He and his wife built this thing in 6 days, all in their 70s. That just shows you how easy they are to assemble. When were you first introduced to cold form, Drew?
1999. My father-in-law bought a distributorship. It came over here from Australia. It was called Multi-Build. And it was it was a caveman building it for sure. Those guys came over and we had bought several distributorships and they helped us. We had a display site and we put some buildings up. And from the get-go, we fell in love with the material, the equipment, the way it looks. It's just, they're a lot of fun to put up. If you like that kind of thing. And my father-in-law was probably one of the, in the early days of it, a key person, helped developing a lot of the changes, trimming them. They've come a long way. It's just from the looks, aesthetically, trims, some of that design stuff. So I started out when they were really rudimentary, and now they're quite elaborate.
What did you do before you got into cold form?
I was in law enforcement, completely changed from one entirely different world to another. So my in-laws had bought those distributorships, and I was a little bit of a burnout phase my last career and wasn't enjoying it. And they had an opportunity for us to move from Colorado to California to help run their business. And things were booming at the time. So it was the right time, the right thing. It was a good change.
How have cold form buildings changed since you first started from that first primitive program you guys were working with?
Well, it's mostly the amount of materials, what's available to us. We were limited on what we had, and it was just based on what had been brought over by the Aussies at the time. Some of the C channels, these, we used to use a lot of hat channel, which is something you don't see a lot in the US. They use it a ton in Australia. So, it's the materials have changed drastically. We've got, the brackets, eave purlins at the time when we started, they were only square. There was no sloped eave purlin. So, just the evolution of attaching a roof has gone 180 degrees from what it was because it was brutal. We started out, the first buildings, they'd come out and you'd run your wall sheets down one side of a wall and you hit the corner, you just bend the sheet around and cut it to fit that corner, run screws through it, it wasn't the best look, doors, you just run wall sheets over doors and cut them in. I mean, I've seen people with their wall sheets attached to the doors, cut a hole in it for the doorknob, and that's how it was like camouflaged. All of that, the fixtures, what we started out with originally for anchor bolts and stuff had a proprietary drill bit, so if you didn't have the right drill bit and you used the wrong drill bit, you just wallowed out holes, just little things like that. It wasn't that long ago that all girts and purlins were only screwed, so we changed it so we could bolt them. And for a lot of people, it's great. I'm sort of in between. For certain buildings, they work really well. For other buildings, I prefer to screw them in. I think they're tighter, they're cleaner.
Recommend to decide which way to go, bolt or screw?
Larger buildings, it's a lot easier. Time wise, it's ultimately it's all about time. I mean, as a contractor, you get paid a price whether it takes you a week or a month. When you've got a larger building, running bolts is easier. You just got to make sure you put all the bolts in. I've seen contractors forget to put bolts in buildings. You got to make sure you get them all in. Screws, are for a smaller building, I can move fast with screws. Smaller, lighter gauge building, we've got a lot of them with 16 gauge material. Pretty easy to zip a screw through those. You start getting, 10 gauge columns or 12 gauge columns and 12 and 14 gauge girts and purlins. It's a little harder for the average person to run those. It takes practice to run them.
That's good to know. I actually did not know the difference between the two.
Yeah, well, and when you're running them, you're clamping. You should be clamping all the things. When you clamp two pieces of 10 gauge together, you'll hear a lot of people complaining of burning up screws, and they'll use electric tools, which they work fine if you know what you're doing. But when you release the trigger, they don't stop spinning, so they're burning heads out with a 20 volt DeWalt. Some of the others are good. Milwaukee's are pretty good. Makitas are okay. I think DeWalt, there's the torque in the drill. 20 volt, they stop when you let go of the trigger, it stops. You can half pull the trigger, and if you run it at the right speed when you're running screws, and you can actually pull a coil like a spring out, but you got to clamp them together. And I'll see people they'll just kind of hold them in place and run it. What happens is screw goes in, threads grab one piece of material and starts pulling it into the screw while they're still trying to screw into to the next piece. And I mean, you get an overlap, you got three pieces of steel you're trying to run it without clamping, and that just kills people. And they get frustrated with it. So they say they got to drill them out. And really, it's just a matter of taking the time to clamp them. But again, it's a time thing. People get in a rush to hurry. And if you just take your time, they're really easy.
I think that was one of the first things that you told me when I started with ACT Building Systems, talking about erecting buildings is DeWalt tools. You got to go with DeWalt. Yeah. And I've heard different people advocate for other brands. Some of it comes down to a matter of preference, but having the right tool for the job definitely matters.
And and it's strange because you get if you can mess something up, I've definitely done it. I've done everything from the easiest way to the absolute hardest way. I built one, they say it doesn't take a rocket scientist. I built one for a guy who builds rockets at Raytheon, some sort of, science engineer, rocket engineer. And he has a building at 12,000 feet. I mean, it's pretty high elevation. You get up there, you can hardly breathe, And the cabin he built only had the electrical was all inside the house. There was no outside electrical outlets. And he was gone one day, and I'd gone up one day and drilled all the holes for all the base connections, for all the brackets. And I got up there, and he didn't leave anything open for me. And it's, it was 2 hours from my house, and I was like, I am not driving back up. So I put every bolt in that building with a breaker and a ratchet bar, and I turned the bolt a little bit, hit it with a hammer, turn it. Needless to say, the next day, my body was killing me from putting in 50 bolts by hand. Refused to do that again. Didn't forget my generator the next time I went. Made sure I was prepared. Yeah. It was a good lesson learned. But point is, you can do it. It's not like I'm that good at it. I just, you got to figure it out and dig in. And I put all the bolts into the concrete with sheer strength and stupidity.
They got in there. I bet that building's still standing too, isn't it?
It is to this day. I've seen it.
What are some of your favorite projects that you sold or built?
We did. I think it's called Taste of the Rockies, or it's the Rocky Mountain. not the Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory, but like Taste of the Rockies. And it's a smaller mom and pop business lady up in near Winter Park, Colorado. Also bitter cold. And we put that up, and it was probably one of the larger gambrels that have been built back at the time with full mezzanine and everything. So that turned out awesome because we had to install, we did everything. Did the plumbing, the electrical through the concrete. We did everything into that building. I mean, it's actually in Hayden, so it's super cold there. And we had to insulate it and installed clean rooms for packaging all the candies and stuff. And a lot of that stuff was we framed that. She wanted everything in steel. So a lot of it, instead of going and getting wood studs, a lot of people frame out rooms with wood studs and stuff. We did everything with what we had on hand. So I built the building and then went through the metal sales website and found other components I could use to frame in, some lighter gauge framing, smaller stuff to frame in all the offices and stuff. And that was a pretty cool job. Turned out really good. Looks good still. 2 years later, went back up and installed an upper level, put a walkout door and a patio on it, tied it into the building. So that was pretty cool. That's a great building.
That
A
sounds
lot
fun.
of smaller stuff. We've done a bunch of like hunting cabins and stuff. Friends of mine I have a friend who owns he does outfitting and stuff. So he bought a few smaller ones and we built cool hunting cabins out in the middle of the nowhere. And they look great, fireproof, or relatively, they don't burn.
Exactly.
That's one in the bird area, and pretty much everything in it survived.
I was in a cabin not too long ago, about 7,200 feet above sea level, and the reason he had to build it, it was probably a 25-minute drive, half of it on gravel roads and everything, all the way up into this beautiful wooded area, the most incredible view you ever seen. But he had to build with steel. He couldn't build it with wood because of the fire risk out there in Arizona.
Well, that's becoming a lot more common. A lot of insurance companies won't underwrite wooden structures. Even if it's a wooden structure and you're cladding with steel and steel roof, the combustibility is, still wood. So, getting steel is sometimes a lot easier to get, somebody to insure it. We have some that we built that, in certain areas of California in the mountains that, they just burn like crazy. And so we put up, all steel structures. They still had to have like several of them had to have 5 to 10,000 gallons on hand in the event of a fire. Forest fires whip through them, and I've seen buildings melted. Years ago, there was one in Victory Hill or Yankee Hill in California that building survived, and everything around it was burned down. They just replaced the sheeting; it was good to go.
Crazy.
Let's talk about your current role right now, because you're working with ACT Building Systems and the support team. How did you come to work for ACT?
Just divine intervention. Phil reached out to me one day. Oddly enough, it was the same day I managed to cut myself pretty good and got back from the ER with 10 stitches in my hand, and I was burnt out on getting beat up and broken and wanted a change. And I actually literally called my wife. I was like, I am sick of this. I got to find something else. She goes, that's really strange. There's an email from Phil. So I checked it, and Phil's like, asked me if I wanted to change a pace. And I don't think he could have hit send on that email fast enough. As soon as I read it, man, I was back on it.
From your experience, what tips and tricks do you know for resolving SARD issues in the ACT Dimension software?
Quite frankly, it's just a lack of training. A lot of folks just don't, they get into it and, you start, poking and pecking. You don't really know what you're doing. And, John has gone through and redone all of our training videos. And again, they've evolved. There was a time when some of them were pretty rough. Our construction videos were not the best. And we keep improving them. And so that's a resource we hand out left and right is, some of the basic stuff, just not knowing how to calc a job where they get jobs, they'll send jobs through with engineering warnings. And they, a lot of folks just don't know because they haven't been thoroughly versed on it. So we use those videos. Probably half the tickets I send are video links. And they're short videos explaining the ins and outs, everything from opening a job to full design, custom engineering. There's a lot to them. So
I like how on the ACT Dimension, if you hit the little star, it actually tells you some ways to solve your issues as well.
Yeah.
Like adding more bays.
People have solutions associated with them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those are covered in the videos. We have each component, not necessarily individual component, but kind of each area of emphasis of the buildings are covered in those. So, a lot of times we just send out videos or Chris Hoffman is the guy who does a lot of support. Chris is he gets spread out because he can do support. He knew a little bit of everything, but Chris is, he's great with solving stuff. And he's gotten us where we do Loom videos. Like if we can solve a problem for you, we make a quick Loom video and send that for you, and we'll show you how we did it, how we save it. Obviously, we'll fix it for you there, but then you've got that in your library for next time, because a lot of them are constantly reoccurring issues, and it can be just a little bit different, but it's still basically the same issue.
What have been some of the most unique buildings you've seen come through support?
With the barn doors, that's what changed it. We used to not be able to add end wall lean-tos to buildings, and now we're on the verge of being able to. That'll be click and play in the design characteristics, so people will be able to just add them themselves. But you get multi-story buildings. We're not where you can add the multi-stories without custom engineering yet, but we can make anything happen. So there's been a few. Again, if you go into building of the month, all of them are really. That's the cool part, is they're all unique buildings. Every single one is unique. Even if you design two of the same building, sometimes they can come out different. The barn dough is probably. That's the coolest evolution. I always loved them. When they started out, it was predominantly agricultural, but now you get into them and people are fixing them up, and they're homes. They're gorgeous.
They're absolutely beautiful. Some of the ones I've been in are absolutely spectacular.
Very.
I like when some of the raw steel is left, because I think it's a unique feature of it. And I hate when people want to hide it. I love when they want to leave some of the raw steel open, so you know what it is.
What advice do you have for people who are new to selling cold form?
Probably the easiest way to put it is know your product. Start reviewing it, get to know what the materials are a little bit. Again, the videos are they're gold. They're a gold mine. I think people who use them learn a whole lot faster. All of that stuff is on the start page of any job. The links to those, the install manuals. You don't have to be an expert builder. You don't have to be an engineer. But when you start seeing the components, you watch the videos, how they go together, it'll make sense in your head when you're designing them, where you see you got certain spacings you have to have, bay spacings, getting spans more than 20 feet can be difficult, and everybody wants everything wide open. And in a perfect world, we can make everything wide open, but sometimes you got to have frames to hold this up. It's still steel. It's lighter, but it's still steel. That's the biggest part, is just kind of learning the videos can't emphasize that enough. They are gold. And
in addition to making sure that all of your tools are DeWalt, what other advice would you have for somebody who's getting ready to build their first cold form building?
Take your time, get to know. It's a time thing. Everybody, you want to get it up. You want to get it going, Spend the first day getting to know the materials, separate them. Make sure you've got all your materials. You got to have the stamp drawings, the order. In the order, make sure in the notes there's some components, there is some cutting. So you got to know what needs to be cut. It's minimal, but there is cutting. I don't want to disparage people. It's not difficult to do all that. Marking them and cutting them is pretty easy. Take the time that first day or two, marking out your concrete, and ultimately concrete has to be square. When your concrete guy's measuring it, go back over it yourself with the measuring tape. It's not tough. Make sure that's right. We can always make it smaller, but we can't stretch it.
This is Drew Sepp. He is with the support team at ACT Building Systems. Drew, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Drew. Nice talking to you.
You too.
You've been listening to Cold Form Buildings Made Easy. We're your hosts, John Cosper and Lauren Toole. Thanks for listening.